The supply office was one of the least glamorous buildings on the base. Its walls were scuffed from years of boots dragging mud across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of cardboard and machine oil. The new lieutenant, James Callahan, walked in with the casual confidence of someone who had spent just long enough in uniform to believe he understood the army. His bars gleamed, his boots were spotless, and he still carried the energy of a man eager to prove himself. Behind the desk sat an older woman. She wasn't in uniform, just civilian attire, a khaki blouse tucked neatly into dark trousers, her hair pulled back into a practical bun threaded with silver. She worked quietly, her eyes down, filling out a stack of forms with a mechanical precision that suggested decades of habit. Nothing about her screamed authority or danger. She looked like someone's grandmother, maybe the sort who baked cookies for visiting grandkids. What caught Callahan's attention, however, wasn't her face or her manner. It was the object leaning against the side of her desk. A rifle case. Not the sleek, black polymer kind young soldiers bought from sporting goods stores, nor the heavy-duty modern versions issued to marksmen. This one was old, genuine leather, the kind that darkened and cracked with time. Its straps were worn nearly white at the edges, its stitching frayed in several places. Scars cut across its surface like a battlefield map, scrapes, gouges, faded, patches where weather and grit had eaten away at the finish. The thing looked like it had seen more miles than most soldiers ever would. Callahan smirked. He nudged the lieutenant beside him. "Take a look at that relic. What did she do? Dig it out of an antique shop?" The other officer chuckled, though less boldly, casting a wary glance toward the woman. But Callahan, still brimming with youthful arrogance, didn't bother lowering his voice. "Looks like it came from the Civil War. Surprised it doesn't crumble to dust when she touches it." The woman didn't flinch. She heard him, he knew she did, but she didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. Her pen scratched steadily across the form, line after line, as though the comment never reached her ears. That silence only made Callahan grin wider. He was used to provoking reactions, whether from peers or from superiors who bristled at his cocky humor. "You'd think Supply would have tossed that thing 20 years ago," he added, deliberately louder this time. Still, nothing. If anything, the quiet confidence with which she ignored him made Callahan feel like a child poking at a stone wall. But he brushed the irritation aside. To him, she was just another civilian employee, someone tucked away in an office while real soldiers carried rifles and faced the world outside the wire. As he signed his forms, he kept glancing at the case. There was something odd about it, something almost unsettling. It wasn't just old, it was personal. Every nick and scratch looked like it carried a story. Callahan dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came. He wasn't here for history lessons. He was here to get gear signed out and move on. But still, his eyes lingered. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of papers or distant thump of boots in the hallway. Callahan leaned casually against the desk, glancing down at the case with exaggerated disdain. "Bet whatever's inside hasn't been fired since Reagan was in office," he muttered, smirking again. That time her hand paused mid-signature, just for a fraction of a second. Then it continued, smooth and unhurried, as if she had merely shifted her grip on the pen. It was such a small movement that Callahan almost missed it, but it planted something in his mind, a seed of curiosity. Why hadn't she reacted before but stopped now? Was it coincidence? Or did the mention of the rifle strike a nerve? The thought nagged at him as he gathered his paperwork. He wanted to ask. He wanted to pry. But pride kept him quiet. He had made his joke, enjoyed his laugh, and that was enough. At least, that's what he told himself as he walked out. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that the battered rifle case he had mocked so carelessly carried a story deeper than any he had ever heard, and an insignia that would soon erase his grin altogether. The next morning, the lieutenant found himself back in the supply office, though he wouldn't have admitted to anyone why. Officially, he needed to sort out some missing entries on the manifest for his unit's equipment. Unofficially, a nagging itch in his mind had dragged him there. He told himself it was curiosity. In truth, it was something closer to unease. The same woman sat behind the desk, methodically working through another stack of paperwork. Her calm presence seemed almost unshakable, as though nothing in the noisy world outside could disturb her rhythm. And once again, leaning against the side of her desk like a silent sentinel, sat the old rifle case. This time Callahan looked closer. He approached under the pretense of checking a form, but his eyes kept drifting toward the battered leather. What he had dismissed yesterday as nothing more than a relic now seemed to tug at him. The scars weren't random scratches. They followed patterns, like history etched by time itself. And then he saw it. At first he thought it was just another scuff mark, a dark streak across the worn hide. But when he squinted, the lines sharpened into meaning, etched into the case, faint but deliberate, were numbers. 2,175 meters. He blinked. The numbers weren't painted, nor stamped. They were carved, carefully burned into the leather as if someone had taken the time to mark them permanently. His first instinct was confusion. Why mark a rifle case with a distance? He leaned in slightly, trying to trace the edges of the engraving with his eyes. It wasn't decorative. It was precise, intentional. "Everything in order, Lieutenant?" The woman's voice broke his concentration. He jerked back, caught in the act of staring. Yes, ma'am. Just double-checking the, requisition codes." His voice faltered. The excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. She didn't press, only slid another sheet of paper across the desk for him to sign. But her eyes, calm, unreadable, lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Callahan forced himself to focus on the form, but the numbers kept burning in his mind. 2,175 meters. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. He'd been through enough training to know distances mattered. Infantry officers drilled on engagement. Ranges artillery officers calculated them down to decimals. But that number, that specific distance, rang with a different weight. It was too exact, too unusual. Later in the hallway, he muttered it under his breath. 2875, 2.875 clicks. He stopped in his tracks. Clicks, kilometers, nearly 3 kilometers. The realization crept over him like a shadow. That number was not a unit designation or some supply code. It was a range, a sniper's range. He remembered the training modules on marksmanship, the lectures about the world's longest confirmed shots. The instructors always spoke with awe when they hit the topic, emphasizing just how rare such feats were. Beyond 2 kilometers, even the best shooters struggled. At nearly 3, the shot was nearly impossible. Bullet drop, wind drift, air density, everything conspired against it. Only the most skilled, the most patient, and perhaps the luckiest could ever claim such a distance. So why was that number carved into her case? He found himself replaying yesterday's encounter, how he had mocked the case, how she had ignored him, except for that brief, almost imperceptible pause when he mentioned the rifle. It hadn't been coincidence. She knew what the case carried. She knew what the number meant. For the first time, the lieutenant felt something. He wasn't accustomed to feeling around older civilians. Intimidation. When he returned to his quarters that evening, the number followed him like an echo. He pulled out his tablet and began searching through old military records, after-action reports, anything that might mention it. But official channels offered nothing. Numbers like that didn't live in paperwork. They lived in whispers, lying. In his bunk, he stared at the ceiling, unable to push the thought aside. That old woman, the one he had so easily dismissed, had a secret etched into leather, a number that marked either legend or myth. And if the whispers he had heard in training were true, then the rifle case he had mocked wasn't just a relic, it was history. Lieutenant Callahan wasn't the type to let things go. Curiosity was his worst habit, and pride often made it worse. That night, after staring at the ceiling in his barracks for hours, he resolved to confront the mystery directly. If there was one thing he hated more than unanswered questions, it was the thought of someone, especially a civilian, holding knowledge that he didn't. The next day, he returned to the supply office, papers in hand. He told himself he had a reason to be there, a small discrepancy on a requisition list. but deep down he knew why he'd come back. His eyes went to the rifle case the moment he stepped inside. The number etched into it might as well have been glowing. The woman didn't look up as he approached. She was the same as before. Composed, unhurried, her pen scratching softly across forms. It was as though she lived in a bubble of calm that the chaos of the base couldn't penetrate. Callahan cleared his throat, setting his papers down with deliberate weight. "Morning," he said. She gave a small nod without breaking her rhythm. "Morning, Lieutenant? More paperwork?" "Something like that," he replied, but his eyes betrayed his real interest, flicking toward the rifle case again. The woman noticed. She always noticed. This time she didn't bother hiding the faintest trace of amusement tugging at her lips. Callahan hesitated, then leaned casually against the counter. His tone was meant to sound offhand, but the question came out sharper than he intended. "So, what's with the number?" Her pen froze mid-stroke. It was a subtle pause, half a second, maybe less, but it felt like an eternity to him. Slowly she set the pen down, folding her hands over the document in front of her. At last, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were steady, clear, the kind that had seen enough of the world not to flinch at curiosity or arrogance. "The number?" she asked softly, her voice even. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smirk to mask his unease. 2875. What's it mean? Some kind of unit code? Maybe a catalog number? Or is it just decoration? For a moment she studied him the way a teacher might study a student, measuring, weighing, deciding whether to answer. Then, with a faint smile, she shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said simply. That answer rattled him more than if she had told him nothing at all. "Try me," he pressed, his curiosity now brimming with impatience. She tilted her head slightly, almost as though amused by his persistence. "Lieutenant," she said, quietly, "some numbers carry weight. They're not for paperwork, not for show. They're for remembering, and sometimes—" Her eyes drifted toward the rifle case. "Sometimes they're for reminding." Her voice wasn't defensive nor secretive. It was calm. Too calm. And that calmness gnawed at Callahan more than anger would have. He wanted details. He wanted facts. But all he had was a riddle wrapped in leather and silence. "So what are you remembering?" he asked, unable to stop himself. For the first time her smile faded. Her expression softened, but not in weakness, in something heavier, something private. "That," she murmured, "isn't a story for today." And just like that, she picked up her pen again, returning to her paperwork as if their conversation had never happened. Callahan stood there, caught between irritation and fascination. Most people would have given up, written her off as eccentric, maybe even delusional, but something in her tone, something unshakably genuine, made him believe she was telling the truth. He left the office with his paperwork complete, but his questions multiplying. As he walked across the base, her words echoed in his mind. Some numbers carry weight. They're for remembering. He didn't know what memory 2,075 meters marked, but he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't trivial. It wasn't random. And whether she wanted to tell the story or not, he was determined to find it. The mess hall was alive with the usual noise. Trays clattering, boots scuffing across the floor, soldiers joking too loudly over watery coffee. Lieutenant Callahan slid into a seat with his plate of overcooked eggs, but his mind wasn't on breakfast. It was still trapped in the supply office, staring at that scarred rifle case and the number etched into it like a ghost. He tried to shove the thought aside, but the silence she'd given him the day before, the refusal to answer outright, gnawed at him. People didn't engrave nearly 3 kilometers into leather for no reason. Numbers like that weren't random. Across the table, a sergeant and 2 corporals were swapping stories, the kind passed around to kill time. One mentioned his uncle who'd served in Iraq. Another bragged about a buddy's convoy surviving an IED blast. Callahan, usually too proud to join enlisted banter, leaned forward anyway. "Hey," he said casually, stabbing at his eggs. "You ever heard of 2875? The sergeant frowned. 2 what? 2875 meters. Callahan let the word hang. The reaction was immediate. One of the corporals straightened, his fork clattering against his tray. The sergeant leaned in, lowering his voice in a way that instantly shifted the mood around the table. "Where'd you hear that?" the sergeant asked. Callahan shrugged, trying to play it off. "Saw it carved into some old gear and supply. Figured it was some kind of code." The sergeant shook his head slowly. "Not a code. A distance." His voice dropped further. "A shot distance." The word sent a jolt through Callahan. One of the corporals nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I heard about it in Afghanistan. Years ago, some sniper, American, made the impossible. Almost 3 clicks out. Windy Mountain Pass, hostile commander lining up an ambush. Whole patrol was pinned down. If the shot hadn't landed..." He trailed off, whistling low. The sergeant gave him a look. "It's more rumor than fact," he muttered. "You know how stories spread." But even he couldn't hide the glimmer of respect in his tone. Callahan's fork froze midway, to his mouth. He'd heard of long-range records during training, numbers that made soldiers whistle and instructors speak with awe, but hearing it here, whispered across a table in the mess hall, carried a different weight. "You're saying someone actually pulled it off? 2.8 kilometers? Callahan pressed. "Not someone," the corporal said, lowering his voice further. "A woman." The lieutenant blinked, taken off guard. The corporal leaned in, eyes shining with the thrill of telling a forbidden tale. "Story goes, she was in the mountains with a small recon team. Enemy had them boxed in, ready to cut them to pieces. Nobody thought they'd make it out. Then she set up, calm as if she had all the time in the world, and pulled the trigger. Took the guy out from nearly 3 clicks away. The patrol escaped. Whole thing's legend now." The sergeant cut him off with a gruff snort. "Legends don't win wars. Paperwork doesn't mention names for a reason. Keep it in perspective." But Callahan noticed he didn't deny it. The table fell into an uneasy silence. The noise of the mess hall seemed suddenly distant, muffled beneath the weight of the story. Callahan pushed his tray aside, his appetite gone. He knew myths circulated in the military, tales of impossible shots and unseen heroes. But something about this one felt different. The etched number, the quiet woman in the supply office, the way she'd looked at him when he asked. He couldn't shake the thought. Could it be her? The possibility gnawed at him as he left the hall, the hum of voices fading behind him. If the whispers were true, if that weathered old rifle case belonged to the sniper of legend, then the lieutenant hadn't just laughed at a relic. He'd laughed at a piece of living history. The whispers in the mess hall followed Callahan back to his quarters, and that night, lying awake on his bunk, he couldn't shake the story. He tried to imagine it. Mountains, wind, dust, soldiers pinned down under fire. The more he pictured it, the more real it became, until the scene played out in his head like a memory that wasn't his. It began in the jagged mountains of Afghanistan, cold, thin air, and silence broken only by distant gunfire echoing through the valley. A U.S. patrol had walked into a trap, boxed in by insurgents who knew the terrain better than anyone. Bullets rained down from the high ridges, pinning the soldiers against rocks with no escape route. Radio chatter screamed with panic, the clipped voices of young men realizing they might not see another sunrise. And then there was her. She lay flat on the ground, her rifle propped against a rock, her cheek pressed against the worn stock. She wasn't panicked. Her breathing was steady, eyes sharp behind the scope. She'd seen fear before, heard men break under it. But she had learned long ago that fear wasted seconds, and seconds were precious. Her spotter crouched beside her, shouting over the gunfire. "Target's too far, can't risk it, we need air support." "No time," she replied calmly. Her voice carried no hesitation, only certainty. She adjusted the scope, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The enemy commander stood on the ridge nearly 3 kilometers away, barking orders, rallying his fighters. If he lived, the Americans below wouldn't. Her rifle was steady, but the conditions were brutal. The wind gusted across the valley, carrying fine dust that shimmered in the afternoon sun. At that distance, the bullet drop was nearly unimaginable, the math dizzying. Most would have called it impossible. But she didn't flinch. Her mind worked quickly, calculating angles, reading the wind like a second language, adjusting for air density at altitude. Every detail mattered. Every fraction of a degree would decide the difference between failure and salvation. The spotter looked at her like she was insane. "It's almost 3 clicks." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her finger curled slowly around the trigger, her body melting into the earth beneath her. Time seemed to slow, the noise of gunfire, the chaos of battle. It all faded into the background until only the target remained. She exhaled, a long, steady breath, and fired. The recoil nudged her shoulder and the round leapt from the barrel, slicing through the thin mountain air. For nearly 10 seconds, nothing happened. The bullet's journey was silent, invisible, a tiny speck of metal, hurtling toward destiny. Then on the ridge, the commander staggered. His body jerked, and a moment later he crumpled to the ground. The valley went quiet. Confusion rippled through the enemy fighters as their leader fell lifeless, and in that hesitation, the trapped American patrol surged forward. With the tide turned, they broke free, rallying behind the impossible shot that had saved them. Radios buzzed with disbelief. Soldiers whispered her name like it was a prayer. But she didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She only pulled back from the scope, her eyes lingering on the fallen figure in the distance. For her, it wasn't about glory. It was survival. It was duty. And it came at a cost she never forgot. Back in the present, Callahan lay in the dark, his heart pounding as though he had been the one to fire. He could almost feel the trigger under his finger, the impossible silence after the shot. 2,875 meters. The number wasn't just a mark, it was a memory, a piece of history burned into leather and bone, carried by a woman who had lived it. And now, he was certain, the legend in the whispers wasn't a myth. She was sitting behind a desk in the supply office, quiet, unassuming, waiting for no recognition. The next morning, Lieutenant Callahan didn't bother pretending he had paperwork to finish. He went to the supply office with only one purpose, to know the truth. The whispers from the mess hall, the flash of that carved number, the vivid images that had haunted his sleep. They had all led him here. The office looked the same as always. The same scuffed floors, the same stacks of forms. And there she was, sitting behind the desk, calm as ever, a pen moving steadily across the page. Beside her, the rifle case rested in its usual spot, quiet and unassuming. Callahan stood in the doorway for a moment, his chest tightening. The woman didn't even look up, as if she already knew why he was there. Finally, he stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor. "I need to ask you something," he said. His voice was firmer than he expected, but underneath it carried a tremor. She finished signing her line before glancing up. Her gaze was steady, patient, almost maternal. "Then ask." He swallowed, glancing at the case, then back at her. "That number," he said quietly. 2875. "I know what it is now, or at least I think I do." Her eyes flickered. Not surprise, but recognition. "It was you," Callahan pressed. His words felt heavier with each syllable. "That shot in Afghanistan, the one everyone whispers about, wasn't it?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. The office filled with silence, broken only by the hum of a ceiling fan overhead. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. Her expression wasn't defensive nor proud. It was weary. "Yes," she said softly. The word hit him like a blow. Callahan straightened, his mouth dry. He had expected denial, maybe a cryptic half-truth like before, but instead the simple honesty of her admission left him unmoored. "You made the shot," he whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. She nodded once. "I did." He waited for her to elaborate, for her to boast, to revel in the awe she knew her answer would create. But she didn't. Instead, her eyes drifted past him as though looking out a window that wasn't there. "It wasn't glory," she said after a pause. "It was necessity. We were pinned down. Men were dying. That shot gave them a chance to live." Her voice carried a quiet strength, but beneath it was a thread of sorrow. Callahan found himself leaning forward. Why keep it quiet? Why not tell people what you did? That's history. That's incredible. Her gaze returned to his, and he felt pinned under it. "Because," she said, "for every soldier who lived that day, there were others who didn't. You don't measure victories by the records you break, Lieutenant. You measure them by the friends you couldn't save." The weight of her words settled heavy in the room. Callahan opened his mouth, but no response came. She reached down, her hand brushing the rifle case as though it were fragile. "That number isn't a trophy, it's a reminder of the day, the place, the people, of what it cost." For the first time since he'd mocked her, Callahan felt shame wash over him like ice water. He saw his smirking self through her eyes, the cocky young officer laughing at a relic he didn't understand. He cleared his throat, his voice quieter. "Yow. I didn't mean to." She held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "You don't owe me apologies, Lieutenant. Just remember this. Respect is earned not by appearances, but by the weight of what someone carries. And some burdens." Her fingers lingered on the case, "are heavier than you'll ever know." He nodded slowly, humbled in a way he had never experienced before. When he left the office, the world outside seemed louder, harsher. The sun glared off the concrete and soldiers moved briskly across the yard. But for Callahan, everything felt quieter inside. The number etched into that rifle case wasn't just a mark of skill. It was a scar. And the woman he had laughed at wasn't just a clerk in supply. She was a soldier who had carved her place into history with a single, impossible shot. After that morning in the supply office, Lieutenant Callahan walked through the base with a weight on his chest he had never felt before. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting behind the desk, calm and unassuming, yet carrying the story of a shot that had spanned nearly 3 kilometers. The realization that he had laughed at her equipment the day before gnawed at him. He had mocked history without knowing it, dismissed bravery without thought, and now he understood the depth of his mistake. He replayed the moment over and over, her steady gaze, the quiet gravity in her voice, the gentle touch on the rifle case as she spoke of the lives lost and the lives saved. Respect, he realized, wasn't something one could fake. It wasn't about rank, medals, or appearances. It was measured in actions and sacrifices, in the invisible scars carried quietly through years of service. The following morning, as he entered the mess hall, he noticed a few young recruits giggling at her presence. They whispered, pointing at the old rifle case, making small jokes about its worn leather and peeling straps. Callahan felt a flash of irritation. It wasn't the humor itself, it was the ignorance behind it. They had no idea what that case represented, and for a moment, he remembered his own arrogance from days ago. He approached the table with a deliberate calm. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. The room quieted instantly. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of authority, not the kind imposed by rank, but the kind earned through conviction. "That case," he continued, pointing to the battered leather leaning against the supply office desk, "belongs to someone who has carried more than any of us can imagine." That number etched into it. 2,875 meters isn't a decoration, it's a story of survival, skill, and sacrifice. The recruits exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that this wasn't a trivial lesson in etiquette. Callahan's voice softened. "The woman who owns it, she made a shot no one else could. She saved lives when all hope seemed lost. And she doesn't brag about it. She doesn't need to. That shot, that day, cost her something no medal could replace." A silence settled over the hall, thick and reverent. Even the chatter of other tables dimmed as the weight of his words sank in. He realized, as he spoke, that he had been given a rare gift, a first-hand lesson in humility. He had witnessed the quiet dignity of someone who had lived a story bigger than any of the jokes, whispers, or casual mockery surrounding her. And in doing so, he began to understand the responsibility that came with knowledge, how easily a story could be twisted, diminished, or forgotten if one failed to honor it properly. When he finished, he looked toward the supply office, where she was no doubt going about her day, unaware that her quiet life had become the centerpiece of his reflection. He wanted to protect her from the casual ignorance of those who didn't know, to make sure her story wasn't reduced to a punchline or a gossip fragment. From that day forward, Callahan's attitude shifted. He no longer saw her as a civilian clerk. He saw her as a guardian of history, someone whose life had intersected with legend, who carried the invisible weight of choices made in seconds that changed everything. Whenever new recruits arrived whispering about her old rifle case or joking about her age or gear, Callahan was the first to speak up. Not with arrogance, not with authority alone, but with a quiet insistence. Respect. Respect for courage. Respect for sacrifice. Respect for the lives etched into the faded leather of a rifle case that had seen history, carried quietly by the woman who lived it. And every time he recounted the story, his own understanding deepened. He realized that leadership wasn't just about rank or orders. It was about knowing when to listen, when to honor, and when to act with integrity. That rifle case, that number, that woman, they had all taught him more about life, bravery, and humility than any training exercise ever could. Weeks passed on the base, yet the story of the old rifle case never left Lieutenant Callahan's mind. Each morning, as he walked past the supply office, his eyes instinctively flicked to the worn leather leaning against the desk. It had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol, a living testament to courage measured in action rather than words. He had changed too. The arrogance that once made him mock her faded, replaced by a quiet humility. He now understood what it meant to carry history without bragging, to honor sacrifices that no one else might recognize. In the presence of the woman and her rifle case, he had glimpsed the difference between fame and duty, between ego and valor. The base had its usual rhythm, drills, paperwork, and endless small tasks that kept soldiers occupied. But for those who knew the story, the rhythm carried an undercurrent of reverence. Callahan noticed the way recruits looked at her now, hesitant to make jokes, unsure if their whispered comments might carry weight beyond their understanding. And when they did, he was ready. "Stop," he would say firmly, though not angrily. "That case has seen more than you'll ever imagine. Respect it." At first, the recruits were confused. Some whispered to each other, wondering why the lieutenant was so protective of an old, battered rifle case. But slowly, curiosity replaced derision. They began asking questions, eager to understand the story behind the number etched into the leather. And Callahan told them, carefully. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize. He recounted only what he knew, emphasizing the courage, the precision, the lives saved, and the cost of such a feat. In the process, something remarkable happened. The legend of the sniper, long whispered and half forgotten, began to take root again. It no longer mattered that the woman never sought recognition. Her story lived through those who honored it, through the lessons Callahan taught, and through the respect shown by every recruit who listened. And the woman herself continued her quiet routine, largely unaware of the ripple she created. She didn't boast. She didn't correct myths or exaggerations. She simply went about her work, her presence steady, unassuming, yet undeniably powerful. Callahan realized that her true strength wasn't in the shot she had made, but in the restraint and humility with which she carried it through decades. One afternoon he lingered in the office a little longer than usual, watching her handle paperwork with meticulous care. The rifle case rested beside her, scarred and faded, its insignia faintly visible under the fluorescent lights. Callahan stepped forward, careful to speak softly. Ma'am, he said, I just want you to know. I've learned more from that case and from you than I ever thought I could. Not just about marksmanship or bravery, but about respect, humility, and what it means to truly serve. She looked up, her expression gentle, almost surprised but not unkind. She gave him a small nod, the faintest acknowledgement, and returned to her work. No applause, no congratulations, just the quiet presence of someone who had earned every ounce of her legacy without asking for recognition. Callahan left the office, pausing for a moment to glance back at the case. He felt a sense of awe and responsibility. The number etched into the leather, 2,075 meters, was no longer just a distance. It was a story, a lesson, a reminder that heroism often existed quietly, far from public praise. From that day forward, whenever someone new arrived at the base, Callahan shared the story. Not as gossip, not as legend, but as truth. The rifle case became a symbol of courage and humility, of actions measured not in medals, but in lives impacted. And the woman, she continued to carry it quietly without fanfare, the keeper of a legacy that would never be forgotten, not because she demanded it, but because those who had learned from her ensured it endured. The lieutenant never laughed at her gear, again. And he never forgot the lesson engraved in leather, whispered in mess halls, and lived quietly in the shadow of impossible courage.